Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our course on the covenants. My name is Michael Gabizon, and today we're going to be looking at part 2 of the Noahic Covenant. Last week we were able to start and do some preliminary work, some background work to see what's happening in the text before we get to the Noahic Covenant. Again, I think that the information in the middle of the covenants is equally as important to kind of see what leads to them. And what we looked at were the genealogies going from Adam and Eve onward. And again, while genealogies are usually not a huge selling point, or we usually don't run to them to do our devotions, I tried to emphasize how important they were, especially because you're trying to trace the seed. You're trying to trace the seed of the woman, right? When God declared that judgment over the serpent, but the seed of the woman's going to crush the serpent's head, who's carrying that seed? And so from Adam, you had the first line, which is the line of Cain, and that was the wicked line. And then you had the line of Seth. And in Seth's line, you had Seth, you had Enosh, who called on the name of the Lord, you had Enoch, who walked with God, and it finally comes down to Noah. So we're introduced to Noah, but then if you remember, in Genesis 6, we're told something about the earth. We're told that the hearts of the people were growing continuously wicked. Every intent, every thought of theirs was continually wicked. And so God says that he has to respond to it. He has to bring justice into the world. And that was going to be done through a flood. However, as we read last week, Noah was not like his generation. He was blameless, and just like Enoch, he walked with God. And so God came to him in Genesis 6, and he said that I'm going to make or establish a covenant with you. If you remember, there's two terms used for making a covenant. One is karat, to cut, and that's like for a new covenant. But the other one is kum, to establish, to reaffirm a covenant. And that's the word that God uses here with Noah. And the emphasis is that there's a continuation from the Adamic covenant going to the Noahic now. And we're going to see that. Some of the laws in the Noahic covenant, they do overlap with the Adamic, but there are some important differences as well. So I hope to be able to highlight those as we go through this. Last week I encouraged you to read through Genesis 9 in order to see if you could kind of pinpoint the different stipulations or the different requirements in the Noahic covenant. Hopefully you were able to do that, and now we'll kind of see if we come up with the same answers. So we're in point 3 of your outline, the Noahic covenant here. And before we jump in, right, we're not really going to discuss the flood so much because, they were in there for about a year and a bit, but we're focused more on Genesis 9 when they come out. But before we jump into the stipulations, there's just two things I want to highlight here. The first is this emphasis of Noah as a priest and a king, or as a king and a priest. Now, if you remember, Adam was kind of a king and a priest, right? Adam had dominion over the animals. He named all the animals. And in the same way, Noah, had dominion over the animals by virtue of caring for them in the ark. And similarly, Adam, he was put into the Garden of Eden in order to worship and obey, which was priestly language. And in the same way, Noah, right when he got off of the ark, what did he do? It says that then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And so we're not really sure what method he followed in offering these sacrifices. This is obviously before the Mosaic Law, where a lot of the instructions are given. But it's clear here that Noah is functioning kind of as a king and a priest also, that these offices, they often mix when you look at the Hebrew Bible. And I know I made this point before, but when you look at Adam, you see it. When you look at Noah right here, you kind of see that priest-king notion. You're going to see it with Abraham, with Melchizedek. You're going to see it with Israel as a nation. You're going to see it with King David. And so when you get to the Messiah in the New Testament, and people say, well, the king priest can't really happen because they're from two different tribes. No. This thing has been happening since the beginning, right? This is a very unique position that God is giving, and it culminates and it leads up to Yeshua, who is our priest, but then he's also the ruler and he's also the king. So these types of threads that you see happening and starting here, if you follow them through, it's a really a lot of fun, and I think it's amazing when you see it throughout the text. So the first thing is Noah as a king and a priest. The second are the parallels with the Adamic covenant. So again, the Noahic is kind of like this recreation, if you would. This is kind of like new Genesis 1:1. And, scholars have pointed a lot of parallels between the two. So I'll just note that, when the Bible opens, we spoke about how the world was tohu vavohu, right? Formless and void. And then it says that the Spirit of God was on the surface of the water. Now, the term spirit is ruach in Hebrew, which could mean spirit, or it could mean the wind of God. And so the wind was there, and it moved all the water, and then vegetation can grow. And that's exactly what happens in Genesis 8, where it says that there's water all over, and then, quote, God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. And that's in Genesis 8:1. So that's one major thing, is that you really have kind of a new recreation of the earth happening right here. You see that parallel where after the waters move, vegetation is able to grow. So it's really a recreation. The second thing is that right when Noah comes out of the ark, you still see some of the commands from the Adamic covenant. They're still intact. It's not like the Adamic covenant is done away with. Those commands are still intact. And you see it here in Genesis 8:17. God says, bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they, what? May breed abundantly. And this goes back to the command in Genesis 1:28 to be fruitful and to multiply. So again, while some people say that the Noahic covenant did away with the Adamic or it kind of replaced it, no, it's still intact. There is overlap, but you need to keep them separate. Okay, so let's go. Now, Noah, he comes out with his family from the ark, and this is where we get the stipulations or the commands of the Noahic covenant. What are some of the key things that we see? Now, granted, there is some debate as to when these commands start, whether it starts in Genesis 9:1 or whether it starts in the end of Genesis 8. I say it starts in the end of Genesis 8, but if you disagree, you can email and we could talk about it. So the first thing that we see is that God will never curse the ground again, that God will not curse the earth. And so he says here, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. Now, some people say, like this is a reversal of the Adamic covenant, right? Remember when God was judging Adam and he said, cursed is the ground? And now here he's saying, I will never curse the ground again. So the Adamic covenant is done away with. That's not a good reading, simply because the two Hebrew words for cursed are different. I don't think that God here is referring to Genesis 3. I think instead a better way to understand the curse at this point is kind of like obliteration or wiping out. That God will not wipe out again all life. That's his promise. And you get that from the context. For example, it says here in red that I will never destroy every living thing as I have done. And you get it again. God rearticulates this later if you want to write down in Genesis 9:11. Genesis 9:11, where he says, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never be cut off by the water of the flood. Neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. So the emphasis here is not so much, there's no more curse on the ground, because we know there is, right? Isaiah 65:66, that's when it's going to be reversed. Here, God is saying that he will never again obliterate or destroy the earth by the flood. We do know that the earth eventually will be destroyed, but it won't be by such a flood again. Now, I think that this is amazing. I think it's, we often miss a detail in this one stipulation, because look what God says. He says, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. You see, in Genesis 6, the reason God sent the flood, and he said that he will not be with the people, is because their intent of evil, their intent of the heart was always evil. And yet after the flood, we're still the same. That means that God, in all justice of the universe, would have every right to bring justice on the earth again and cast judgment. but instead it's as though he promises and withholds himself just from his own doing in order to have that relationship, in order to look forward to that redemption that mankind could experience. And so when you read this, think about how we're always under this perpetual grace that we don't deserve, but God promised just by his own volition, just by himself, that he will not do that, so that we could be in relationship with him. We still have this evil heart, this evil condition. Our condition is the same as in Genesis 6, but God says that will not happen again. So you see the graciousness of God in this Noahic covenant, which I think is very, very cool. So the first point that we have, God will not curse the earth. God will not curse the earth. The second point is that we are to be fruitful and multiply. Again, this is found in Genesis 9:1. This is also found in Genesis 9:7, where God says, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. As for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it." Here, this is very similar to Genesis 1:28, where God says to be fruitful and multiply. One of the emphases, however, with the Noahic covenant is that they're supposed to spread out. They're supposed to go all over and populate the earth. Now, if you know a story that's coming up in the Genesis narrative, the Tower of Babel, you see that people did not always obey this Noahic covenant. But nevertheless, stipulation number 2 is that to be fruitful, to multiply, and you could add in your notes, to populate the earth, to spread out, is one of the key commands. Now the third command, again, you could say it's similar to the Adamic covenant, but there is some caveats. There are some differences. So God says to Noah, "Into your hands they are given," speaking about the animal kingdom. And so, again, when you look at the 3 pillars that we spoke about for the Adamic covenant, obviously harmony and dominion over the animal kingdom was one of them. So this is similar. However, there are 2 important differences. First, God says in Genesis 9:2, "The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast." Now that we have dominion over them, it's going to be like it was before, except now they're going to have this fear of you. Now, some scholars say, ooh, God was just trying to help out Noah. And that way he could have dominion over them, and they'll run away from him. But, when an animal is afraid, it's maybe going to run away, or it's maybe going to attack. And I don't think that this is necessarily God helping out. I think it's showing kind of a fractured relationship or a shadow of what was in the Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, Adam had dominion over the animals, but there was no notion of fear or animosity, whereas now there is. And when you read by the prophet Isaiah about messianic expectations or the messianic age in Isaiah 11, one of the key descriptions is the harmony between the animal kingdom, where the wolf and the lamb kind of lie together, and the animal kingdom and humanity. Right, where it says that the child is going to play with the cobra, you're going to have that harmony there. So the fact that we don't have it now, I don't think is God helping out necessarily. I think it's, we still maintain our position as having dominion over the earth, but there's kind of that fractured relationship. So that's one of the caveats. The second difference that we have with dominion over the earth is that now we're able to eat animals. So it says, "Every moving thing that is alive shall be food for you. I give it all to you as I gave the green plant." So Adam's diet was predominantly plants, right? In the Garden of Eden, or whatever it wasn't animals. That's one of the important changes that we see in the Noahic covenant. Now, as to why God allowed this, or as to why this was a shift, it's really not clear. Why did all of a sudden we're allowed to eat animals? Some people say that, it was right after the flood and the vegetation really wasn't good yet. And so, there was no food, so that's why they could eat animals. Obviously, that's not in the text. It's a possibility. We're not entirely sure why God had allowed this. However, he does provide a rule. He says that there's one restriction. You may eat the animal, but you are not permitted to eat the blood. You are not permitted to eat the blood of the animal. And so again, why? What's wrong with eating the blood? Some people say this is a move away from paganism, because what they used to do is they used to drink the blood of an animal or of a person with the hopes that they would get their strength and their power. So maybe God was saying, don't do that pagan stuff. I think that the reason is provided in the text, where God says that the life is in the blood. And so what he's saying is you're allowed to eat the animal, but it must be in an ethical way. You're not allowed to eat the animal while it's alive. It must be killed before you can eat it. And I think that the moral of this is valuing God's creation, valuing what God has given, and treating it with respect. And that's kind of the theme that you see throughout this Noahic covenant. So, could we eat animals? Yes. Are they being treated ethically? Well, they're part of God's creation. Are we treating them well? I think that's the moral behind don't eat the blood. As an aside, obviously blood becomes very central later on in the Mosaic Code. The blood of the animal comes to represent us. It comes to kind of cover our sins. The animal functions as a substitute for us. And so its blood is spilled. Its life is given in place of ours. So blood is very important in the scriptures. There's a lot of laws regarding purity and impurity. But I think one of the main emphases here is this ethical treatment of God's creation as we represent him on earth. Okay, so that's point number 3. So point number 1, God will not curse the earth. Point number 2, to be fruitful and to multiply. And then point number 3, dominion over the animal kingdom. And again, a lot of these are very similar to the Adamic covenant, but there are changes. Okay, there are differences, there are exceptions. It's not like it was before. And then the fourth and the final one is what some people would call capital punishment. This is where you could really see a contrast between the way that God views animal lives, which we're supposed to treat ethically, but then human lives, right? And God says that whoever sheds man's blood, this is in Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Meaning, if you kill someone, then you need to be killed, which is a just consequence. And so how do we understand this regulation? What's the point? What's the main emphasis of this regulation? First, I think that this consequence is given in order to prevent people from doing what they used to do. You see, when you look at Genesis 3, 4, 5, 6, you see the line of Cain. You see that he murdered, that Lamech murdered. You see Genesis 6, that the heart was wicked and that there was turmoil and violence going on. Murder was a big thing, and death was what we say antithetical. It was complete opposite to who God was. And so here I think that this was a preventative measure. You know, Cain, Lamech, they were able to murder, but there were no consequences, right? They said, oh, there's a mark on me. No one could touch me. Now God is saying if someone murders, they will be murdered. That is a just consequence. So that's one element. Second, I think that this kind of brings in a sense of community or communal responsibility. Right? I don't think God is saying, hey, if you think someone killed someone, you can go, carte blanche and go kill them. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think that this is looking towards kind of a human government, an accountability system where there is justice that will be instituted. So he's kind of giving the keys of the dominion over to humanity in that sense. Later on, we're in the Mosaic law. You see this law kind of worked out a lot more, where if someone kills someone, then they're going to be killed. And one of the main reasons for that is because when innocent blood is spilled, God says that it's like impure in the land. There's like an impurity in the land and God cannot dwell there. And so in order to remove that impurity, the person who killed them must be killed as well. And so a lot of this has to also do with the presence of God and where he dwells. And one fascinating thing, just to bring it up very quickly, in Numbers particularly, you have this discussion of a city of refuge, right? And so let's say, and there's a law code on this, let's say that someone kills someone else accidentally, right? Like I think the situation is, you're trying to axe down a tree, and you go like this, and the head flies off and knocks someone in the head and they die. You didn't mean to do it, right? But then what happens? So you're still guilty. There's still impurity that has to be addressed. But what do you do? And so they're able to run to the city of refuge so that they're not killed by an aggressor, or, for capital punishment. They're able to run there, and they stay there waiting for justice. But here's the really cool thing. As they're waiting there, if the priest who is there dies, then that person is able to leave free. Why? Because it's as though the priest, the righteous priest, took on that person's punishment in death. And from that passage, as well as some others in Jewish thought, you have this idea that the death of the righteous atones for the sins of the wicked, right? And I think that that's a really interesting picture when you look at Yeshua, that the death of the righteousness, that he took on our transgressions as a righteous person, so that we can be and have atonement. So you see this right in the Hebrew Bible, which I think is very fascinating. So in any case, that obviously goes a little bit past the Noahic Covenant. Here you just kind of have a simple statement. If you kill someone, then you will be killed, which is probably like, don't kill anyone. That's the main point that you're getting at here. So these 4 stipulations, this is what we have for the Noahic Covenant. And then God goes on and he describes the parties of the covenant, meaning who's actually involved here. And at first, in Genesis 6:18, God says, I'm going to make it with you, Noah, and your family and your children. But then here in Genesis 9:8 through 11, God says that he really makes it with all of creation. God says, now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you, with your descendants, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast on earth, and all that comes out of the ark. And so what this shows is that God's covenant is not just with humans. God's covenant is with all of creation. And that's why, Isaiah 65:66, the reversal of even the cursed ground. In Paul, he speaks about all creation groaning. The reversal is what we're looking for. And again, when we step back and we think, okay, God made this covenant not just with humans, but with all creation, what does that mean about my responsibility to creation, to the animal kingdom, and to one another? Because we're all under this Noahic covenant. So if God has this covenant with them, what does that mean as a representative of God? What is my obligation to the world? What is my obligation to the animal kingdom and to people? And I think that perhaps many of us don't spend enough time, I know I'm definitely guilty of that, don't spend enough time considering that. Obviously, God values these things. And so what does that mean for my own actions and what I can do to protect the earth? So we have here the parties of the covenant, which is everyone. And then finally, the sign of the covenant. What you're going to see is that most covenants do have a specific sign. The Adamic didn't really, although you could say it's physical death, or it's, the cursed ground, something like that. But here you have an explicit sign for the Noahic covenant, which is what we call a rainbow. Although in the biblical text, it's really kind of a bow, for like a bow and arrow. That's what it is, a bow in the cloud. So, when you see the sun and it's raining a little bit and you see the rainbow, that is the sign of God's unending covenant with all of creation and with you and with me. So, again, kind of in summary here, when you look at the Noahic covenant, you do see a lot of similarities with the Adamic, but there are important differences. Right? You do see this notion that God makes a covenant with the entire world, that is kind of right after creation. There's a recreation of the earth, that he tells everyone to multiply and to fill the earth, but there are important differences. Eating the animals, capital punishment. So I don't think we could just say the Noahic covenant did away with the Adamic covenant, or that the Noahic covenant somehow is just kind of a replacement of the Adamic. I think that they're both intact. They're both there. There's similarities, but there are also differences. So we want to keep that in mind. So, in summary, The Noahic Covenant, you could say, is a royal grant with creation. If you remember, you have two types of covenants: suzerain vassal treaty, which we'll get to much later, and then you have a royal grant. And this is where God comes, and out of his own volition, out of his own will, he says, I'm going to make this covenant with you. And all of humanity is under it. As a quick reference here, this passage is found in Isaiah 24, 4 through 5. And there's actually a reference to this everlasting covenant. It says, the earth mourns and withers, the world fades and withers, the exalted of the people of the earth fade away. The earth is also polluted by its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated statutes, and broke the everlasting covenant. Now you may question, what is this everlasting covenant? I don't think that we could say it's the Adamic covenant, since there are no real laws that you can break in the Adamic covenant, apart from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which we don't have anymore. Instead, they're breaking the everlasting covenant, which is the Noahic covenant. And these people, they're not under the Abrahamic covenant or Mosaic, right? These are not, this is not Israel. So this shows that this is still intact and for all people. So think about the Noahic covenant as a royal grant, as something that we're under. There's nothing that can break this covenant, because God did not say that it's contingent on anything or anyone. This covenant will always be in place. Now, in this covenant, there are consequences, right? If you kill someone, you will be killed. You cannot eat an animal with blood in it, or else there are consequences. There are consequences, but nothing you can do will break the covenant. And that's what's the amazing thing, that we're always under God's grace, no matter who we are. So I love that. So to close, why the flood? Obviously, the flood brings up a lot of hard emotions, a lot of questions about the justice of God. Is it really fair? And I think that's a really good question to bring up, and it's a really good point to bring up. But you could also look at the question slightly differently. If the thought of every man was evil continuously, you could ask, where was the justice if God never intervened? Right? You could say, well, how come God did that? How come he brought murder, and how come he killed? Right, but is it all murder and kill, or is it bringing justice? You look at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the people wanted to rape the visitors who were coming, or you look at the story of Judges, when it's horrendous towards the end of the book what they do. And you could, see that what happens when people do what is right in their own eyes. And so when you look at the flood, you could question how come he did this, but then you could also ask, well, where was the justice? And I think that's what God brought, was justice down to earth. Also, keep in mind that when you have this covenant relationship, when you have this flood, it all has to do with a covenant, right? God, before the flood was sent, started a covenant. After the flood, made this covenant, which is all about relationship. And so God wants to stay in relationship with people. And I think that's one of the main lessons that we could take away from this. So moving on, next week, we're going to move from covenants made with the entire world all the way to a covenant in Genesis 12 made with one specific family, namely Abraham. And we're going to look at the covenant with Abraham and with all of his descendants. But again, as we're moving on from Noah, I want you to think to yourself, okay, who is carrying the seed of the woman, right? This is an important promise, and it's really going to culminate in Abraham. But remember, Noah has 3 kids, right? He has Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So which one is carrying the seed? And I think the text really tells us. But you have to kind of read between the lines and pay close attention. And so my challenge for you for next week, we have Genesis 9, you have the Noahic covenant. Genesis 10, you have really a whole list of genealogies. And I know, it's kind of tempting, just to skip over it. Who cares about genealogies? You have a whole list of genealogies of Noah's 3 sons. And I want you to notice that at the end of each of their genealogies, there's kind of this summary statement, that each one was divided by his own language, that each one went to their own nations, and that each one entered into their own lands, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. But here's my question. After Genesis 10, you get to Genesis 11. And how does Genesis 11 open up? Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And you're probably thinking, didn't we just go back in time? Genesis 10, they're all divided. Genesis 11, you have this story of the Tower of Babel. Why is the story of the Tower of Babel put here right before we meet Abraham? So I challenge you to read through this section and kind of have that question in mind. What's different with Abraham versus the Tower of Babel? What is the author trying to articulate? So that concludes our time. That concludes the Noahic Covenant. And I look forward to moving on and to exploring the Abrahamic Covenant next week. So I look forward to seeing you. And until the next time, be blessed.
כפר עלינו חסדו ואמת אדוני לעולם הללויה כי כפר עלינו חסדו ואמת אדוני לעולם Adonai kol goyim, hallelu et Adonai kol goyim, shabechuchu kol chaumi, shabechuchu kol chaumi, ki kafar aleinu hasdo, ve'emet Adonai le'olam, hallelu. כפר עלינו חסדו ואמת אדוני לעולם